The moment Julian Kent was announced as the surprise guest on Wilderness Journey, a silence fell over the rustic lodge set. Ethan Hayes felt the air leave his lungs. He hadn't expected him. In the 5 years since their meteoric rise, they had maintained a careful, calculated distance, two kings ruling separate kingdoms. The show that had made them, a gritty HBO detective series called City of Shadows, had also forged a bond the public never knew, and then shattered it completely. Now, the architect of that destruction stood before him, possessing a quiet gravity that he hadn't had 5 years ago. The host, ever the professional, commented on how long the fans had waited for this reunion, for the two stars of the internet's most shipped pairing to share a screen again. Julian moved to stand beside Ethan. His voice a low murmur meant only for him. "Ethan, it's been a while." A masterful performance from a man who had won 3 Emmys in 5 years. Their last encounter had been anything but civil. Ethan's mind drifted back to a sweltering summer on a soundstage, to his first encounter with Julian. He had been just as forward then, approaching with a bright, infectious energy, declaring his long-held admiration and his excitement to finally work together. Ethan had offered only a cool nod in response. Later, gathered around a crackling fire pit with the other cast members, the conversation turned personal. One of the younger actresses asked Julian if he had been single all these years, or if there had been any unforgettable relationships. Julian's gaze lowered, as if genuinely lost in thought. He admitted there had been one. The group buzzed with interest, everyone except Ethan. When pressed about the timing, Julian answered simply, 5 years ago. Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes meeting Julian's across the fire. 5 years ago, they had been together. The lines between their characters on screen and their reality had blurred into a passionate, secret affair. Ethan remembered the heady rush of it, the constant, thrilling proximity during filming. He had been the first to realize his feelings were something more than professional. During one stunt, Julian had stumbled and fallen against him, and in that split second, gazing at his face, Ethan was consumed by an overwhelming urge to kiss him. His heart had hammered against his ribs in a wild, unfamiliar rhythm. He grew possessive, a bitter taste filling his mouth whenever he saw another actor share a laugh with Julian. He began to withdraw, terrified that Julian, who had dated women before, would be disgusted by his feelings. Julian, however, remained oblivious, a whirlwind of casual intimacy. He would drink from Ethan's water bottle, playfully lift Ethan's shirt to admire his abs, even invite him to touch. Ethan, whose heart was anything but pure in those moments, always pushed him away, fearing his own resolve would crumble. He had tried to maintain a distance, limiting their interactions strictly to scenes, but it was Julian who finally shattered the pretense. One evening, after seeing Ethan laughing with a friend who had visited the set, Julian cornered him, his expression a storm of confusion and hurt. He asked, his voice laced with a wounded tone, if Ethan hated him. Ethan denied it, avoiding his gaze. Julian was relentless. He backed Ethan against a wall, forcing his chin up. He demanded to know, looking him in the eye, why he was being so distant. Ethan, his hands clenched into fists, replied coldly that he didn't think they were that close. The response was a kiss, not gentle, but fierce and demanding. Ethan shoved him away, his heart in a frantic staccato, wiping his mouth as if to erase the contact. He accused Julian of being insane. Julian agreed that seeing Ethan smile at someone else made him want to resort to violence. He confessed that his meaning should have been obvious. He was jealous. When Ethan pointed out the simple fact that they were both men, Julian countered by reminding him of the very show they were filming, of the two men they portrayed. He then wrapped his arms around Ethan, whispering the question that had started everything. "Ethan, will you be with me?" It was a relationship Julian had insisted on starting. And he was the one who had insisted on ending it. A bitter smirk touched Ethan's lips at the memory. Across the fire, Julian met his gaze and announced to the group that the past was best left in the past, effectively shutting down the line of questioning. The next day's task involved preparing lunch from scratch. The four men were assigned to forage for ingredients. Caleb, a rising star who had recently played Ethan's apprentice in a film, slung an arm around his shoulder. He jokingly called him boss and suggested they go catch some fish in the nearby stream. Ethan smiled and agreed. From across the yard, Julian's face darkened, his stare burning a hole where Caleb's hand rested on Ethan's shoulder. It was the same possessive glare from years ago. He quickly inserted himself between them, asking Ethan to teach him to fish as well. Ethan coolly informed him that he and Leo, the singer, were assigned to gather vegetables, and that learning to fish would be too time-consuming. He turned and walked away with Caleb, leaving Julian standing alone. In the stream, the trout were slippery and fast. Ethan lost his footing and tumbled into the cold water, and Caleb, trying to help, fell in right after him. They emerged soaking wet but triumphant, with two large fish on a makeshift spear. Walking back to the lodge, Caleb playfully patted Ethan's stomach, complimenting his physique for the benefit of the audience. Ethan returned the gesture, laughing. When Julian saw them enter, dripping and close, his eyes practically shot flames. He declared that Ethan needed to change his wet clothes, and without waiting for a reply, grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the stairs, ignoring the bewildered looks from the rest of the cast. Inside the bedroom, away from the cameras, Julian immediately started trying to pull off Ethan's wet shirt. Ethan shoved him away, demanding to know what his problem was. Julian grabbed his wrists, his voice a low, furious snarl. He seethed about how happy Ethan looked with Caleb, about how the younger actor's casual intimacy drove him mad. Ethan responded by kicking him squarely in the stomach. Julian stumbled back, then surged forward, pinning Ethan against the wall. He leaned in close, his breath hot and ragged with a strange mix of anger and despair. He asked if Ethan had forgotten what they once were, offering to help him remember. "You know it was in the past, you son of a bitch," Ethan snarled, slamming the back of his head into Julian's face. They crashed to the floor, trading blows born of 5 years of pent-up rage and hurt. Panting, Ethan glared up at him. He told Julian not to be pathetic, reminding him that he was the one who said goodbye. The memory was sharp as glass. Shortly after their show had aired and become a phenomenon, Julian had broken up with him via a single text message. Just days before, he had been flooding Ethan's phone with messages about how much he missed him. That night, Ethan had driven through a torrential downpour to Julian's apartment, only to see a woman leaving the building. He had confronted Julian, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest, demanding an explanation. Julian's eyes had been like ice. He'd said it was exactly what it looked like, coldly asking if Ethan wanted a detailed description. Ethan's voice had trembled as he asked why, if Julian had always preferred women, he had pursued him in the first place. Julian's reply had gutted him. He claimed he had gotten too deep into his role, that he had been in love with the character, not with Ethan. And now he was out of character. The words had been a physical blow. Ethan had punched him, screaming, asking if he found this amusing. Julian, dabbing blood from his lip, had said with chilling finality that Ethan shouldn't mistake a role for reality. He had told him to never contact him again. It was the first time Ethan had cried since his mother's death. And now, this same man was acting as if he had the right to be jealous. Ethan rose to his feet, looking down at Julian with pure contempt. "You disgust me, Julian," he said, his voice level and sharp. He asked if Julian truly thought he could just reappear after 5 years and reignite something he'd so callously extinguished, just to watch Ethan fall apart all over again. The anger surged, and he grabbed Julian's collar, but stopped himself from throwing another punch. Julian's bravado crumbled. His eyes turned red, and he offered his face, telling Ethan to hit him, to do whatever it took to get his anger out, as long as he wouldn't be ignored anymore. The silence, he whispered, was worse than death. Ethan scoffed and let him go. He told Julian that hitting him would only dirty his hands, and that his flip-flopping behavior only made him more pathetic. He grabbed a fresh set of clothes and walked into the bathroom, leaving Julian crumpled on the floor. That night, Ethan informed the producers he was quitting the show. The director agreed, but asked him to stay for 3 more days while they found a replacement of his stature. The announcement was made to the cast the next morning. Julian immediately cornered him, his face pale. He asked if he was the reason for Ethan's departure. Ethan confirmed it without hesitation. He reminded Julian of their agreement from 5 years ago, never to appear in the same place again. Julian fell silent, then insisted that he should be the one to leave. But Ethan told him it was already done. On the final day of filming, while gathering vegetables from the garden for his own farewell dinner, Ethan overheard a conversation. It was one of the young actresses, Jiangnan Nanjiang Nianyan, asking Julian for his number, expressing her admiration. Julian's response was a flat, cold no. When she persisted, he stated bluntly that he wasn't interested in women. Ethan, startled by such a candid admission on camera, accidentally stepped on a twig, crying out as a sharp pain shot up his leg. A snake. Julian was on him in an instant, smashing the snake with a rock before scooping Ethan into his arms. Ethan, mortified at being carried, ordered Julian to put him down, the rush of blood to his head making him dizzy. Julian ignored him, his voice tight with panic, that it was a venomous snake and movement would speed up the poison. He laid Ethan down, tore open his pant leg, and without a second's hesitation, put his mouth to the wound, sucking out the venom. Ethan yelled at him, telling him he could get poisoned himself, but Julian held his leg in a vice grip, spitting blood onto the ground until it ran clear. By the time the paramedics arrived, Julian had collapsed. Ethan woke up in a sterile white hospital room. His agent explained what had happened, saying that if Julian hadn't acted so recklessly, Ethan might not have made it. He immediately got up and limped to Julian's room, but seeing him awake inside, talking to his own assistant, Ethan turned back. He didn't need to say thank you. A short while later, Julian appeared in his doorway. Ethan feigned sleep. He felt Julian take his hand, the warmth of his grip, and then the distinct dampness of tears. He heard Julian whisper, his voice thick with emotion, that he had been terrified, that if anything had happened to Ethan, his own life would have no meaning. He confessed then that it had never been about being in or out of character. He had always loved Ethan. He promised to stay away, to never bother him again, as long as Ethan was safe. He pressed a gentle kiss to the back of Ethan's hand before leaving. The footage from the show exploded online. Julian's declaration of not liking women, the raw, desperate way he saved Ethan, and a dozen other compiled clips of his intensely possessive gazes became viral sensations. The story was everywhere. His agent, Frank, rushed to the hospital in a panic. He told Ethan that Julian was preparing a statement, one that would claim he had been carrying a one-sided torch for Ethan for years, that Ethan had repeatedly rejected him, and that he was retiring from acting to prevent any further disruption to Ethan's life. Frank begged Ethan to intervene. Then he told him the truth about what had happened 5 years ago. Julian hadn't cheated. He had been blackmailed by Summer Vance, the powerful daughter of a studio head who had become obsessed with him. She had discovered their relationship and threatened to ruin Ethan's career, to have him blacklisted from the industry entirely. To protect Ethan, Julian had been forced to break his heart. He'd spent the next 5 years playing a long game, pretending to entertain Summer's advances while secretly gathering evidence of her family's corrupt dealings. He worked tirelessly, building his own power and influence until he was strong enough to bring them down. Only then, after ensuring she could never hurt Ethan again, did he dare to re-enter his life. He had never told Ethan any of it, too ashamed of the pain he had caused. His love for Ethan had been real from the very beginning, long before the show even started. Before Ethan could process this, a man disguised as an orderly entered his room, offering to help him see Julian. Thinking it was a hospital employee, Ethan allowed the man to push his wheelchair. But when they reached Julian's room, the man pulled a knife and held it to Ethan's throat. Julian, seeing this, froze, his voice trembling as he demanded to know who the man was. The attacker was a fan, an obsessive who had followed Julian's career for nearly a decade. He was furious that Julian would throw away his future for another man. As he spoke, his grip tightened, and Ethan felt the cold steel prick his skin. Ethan caught Julian's eye and jerked his head backward. In one swift motion, he threw his weight back, ramming his head into the attacker. Thrown off balance, Ethan and the man tumbled to the floor. The knife swung wildly toward Ethan's neck. Julian lunged, grabbing for the blade. The fan yanked it back, and the steel sliced deep into Julian's hand and forearm. Blood gushed, staining his white hospital gown a brilliant crimson. The fan, horrified, dropped the knife just as security stormed the room. Julian ignored his own injury, pulling Ethan into a fierce, shaking embrace. "You're okay," he gasped over and over. Ethan, seeing the blood soaking through Julian's sleeve, felt a wave of panic and fury. He yelled at him, asking if his hand meant nothing, why he always made these life-altering decisions without consulting him, why he always had to be the martyr. Julian finally let go, his eyes wide and pleading. He asked if Ethan could stay with him while the nurses treated his arm. Ethan, exhausted, muttered that it wasn't like he could go anywhere with his injured leg. Later, after Julian's arm was bandaged, Ethan asked him why he would so easily throw away his career. Julian explained that it was for him, that he should bear the consequences. The rage in Ethan's chest flared. He asked Julian if he had ever, in all these years, considered him an equal partner. He was a man, not a fragile thing that needed constant protection. Julian looked stricken. He whispered. He confessed that all he ever wanted was for Ethan to be safe, to be untouched by the ugliness of the world. Ethan shot back, asking if Julian thought their breakup hadn't hurt him, that it hadn't been its own kind of damage. He thought of the year he'd lost to alcohol and grief, a hollowed-out man haunted by a ghost. Julian's voice cracked. He said he knew he was wrong, that living without Ethan was a pain worse than death, but he hadn't dared risk Summer's wrath. He then admitted that retiring was something he'd planned for years. He was tired of the industry. He had only stayed because it was the only way he could feel close to Ethan, even from a distance. With his eyes red-rimmed and full of a desperate hope, he asked, "Do we have another chance?" "We're not compatible," Ethan said, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. He wheeled himself out of the room. 2 years passed. Both men had transitioned to roles behind the camera, becoming successful producers. Their paths crossed inevitably. Julian never mentioned love again, but his presence was a quiet constant. He was the one who drove Ethan home after industry parties, who called to schedule lunches, who sent perfectly timed holiday messages. On lonely evenings, he would show up at Ethan's apartment building and ask if he had plans, offering to cook if he didn't. He never pushed, never crossed a line, giving Ethan no reason to refuse his gentle persistence. That winter, Ethan went home for the holidays. His father, now gray and weathered, told him it was time he found a partner, man or woman, so he wouldn't be alone. Ethan had come out to his family years ago, and after a difficult period, they had come to accept it. When his father mentioned finding a partner, the only face that came to Ethan's mind was Julian's. His father, seizing the moment, revealed he had already arranged a meeting with a man named Marcus who was in town for the new year. Not wanting to disappoint him, Ethan agreed. The next day at the restaurant, Marcus was handsome and charming, a successful businessman. They spoke easily, and Marcus suggested they exchange numbers, saying he would be happy to be friends. As Ethan pulled out his phone, he saw a text from Julian sent the night before. "Happy New Year, Ethan. It's snowing. I miss you right now." It was accompanied by a selfie of Julian standing in the snow, looking impossibly young and handsome. "It seems your heart is already taken," Marcus said gently. Ethan looked up, startled. "You can't hide love," Marcus explained. "The way your eyes softened when you looked at your phone. It was for someone else." In that moment, Ethan knew it was true. His love for Julian hadn't faded. It had deepened, nurtured by 2 years of quiet devotion. But love and compatibility were different things. Marcus, sensing his hesitation, offered a partnership of mutual respect, a comfortable life together. Ethan considered it, and realized the thought of that life with anyone but Julian was unbearable. He thanked Marcus for helping him realize something important and insisted on paying for the meal. As they left the restaurant, he saw a figure standing across the street, a silhouette against the falling snow. It was Julian, his dark coat whipping in the wind. When he saw Ethan with Marcus, his face crumpled, his eyes instantly turning red with a familiar, wounded look. Marcus leaned in and whispered, "There's the man you're in love with." Julian rushed across the street, grabbing Ethan's hand, his voice frantic. "Ethan, are you really leaving me?" He explained that he'd heard about the blind date and had driven hundreds of miles through the night. He begged for one more chance, promising to change, to listen, to do anything. "Okay," Ethan said quietly. "Let's try again." Julian stared at him, stunned into silence for a moment before surging forward and kissing him, long and deep, right there in the middle of the snow-covered street. When they broke apart, Marcus was gone. Julian's demeanor shifted, a flash of the old possessiveness in his eyes. He asked who the man was. Ethan told him it was his blind date, and Riley asked if Julian was going to start a fight. Julian's expression turned into a pout. "I'm your dog," he declared. "Yours alone. There can't be any other dogs." Ethan laughed, shaking his head at the ridiculous, passionate man he loved. He took his hand. "Come on. Let's go home and get ready for New Year's dinner." Julian, looking panicked, said he needed to buy gifts to bring to his father's house. Ethan squeezed his hand. "You're already here. Just come home with me." That night, Julian charmed his father, and after a haze of celebratory drinks, he followed Ethan to his room, pulling him into the shower with a wicked grin, insisting they save water. Ethan suspected he was faking being drunk, a suspicion that was confirmed as the night wore on, leaving his back aching and his heart, for the first time in 7 years, completely whole.